Odds are you know a veteran, whether it's your uncle, your neighbor, or a teacher or a coworker. Today, let's unlock how to communicate with and support our heroes. Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere, a podcast by PsychI, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychological science to a diverse range of current events and to better your life. This episode is made possible through a special PsychI sponsorship with CSPP Alliant International University. If you'd like to learn about graduate programs at CSPP, be sure to check out the link in the show notes for this episode. Would you prefer to read along as you listen? A written transcript is available. See the link in the show notes for this episode. Joining me for this episode is Dr. Stephen R. Thorp, Distinguished Professor at CSPP Alliant International University. Dr. Thorp is the past Division Director of Mental Health at the VA San Diego Healthcare System, and he served as Program Director of its PTSD clinical team. He's authored more than 70 publications and made more than 100 presentations at regional and national conventions. And he's received more than $6 million in grant funding for randomized controlled trials investigating clinical outcomes of psychotherapy for PTSD using telehealth technologies. Dr. Thorp, welcome to Psych Everywhere.
Thank you very much, Bradley.
So before we get started, there's a few things I'd like to share. First, today's conversation could be sensitive for some listeners. So if that's you, please don't hesitate to turn off this episode. Second, did you know that veterans and their loved ones can now call the Veterans Crisis Line to receive confidential support 24/7? Just dial 988 and then press 1. And third, students interested in veterans' mental health are invited to join CSPP's SAMP, which is the Student Association for Military Psychology. It's free to join. Just contact samp.alliant.sd@gmail.com. So, like I was saying a little bit before we started recording the conversation, my grandfather was a veteran. He served in World War II and Korea, and he was the nicest feller, and he always had a cheesy joke of some sort in his back pocket and all that. But he never really spoke too much about what all he experienced in the Army. He really kept that part of his life pretty quiet, and I don't think his family ever really knew how to talk to him about it, or really even should we push him to talk about it. So I was really interested in having this chat today, and I imagine that a lot of other people have these same questions and thoughts too. So I'm going to jump right in. First of all, how did you become interested in supporting veterans?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you said, a lot of Americans either are veterans or are dependent of veterans, either children or partners of veterans, about 20% of the population, actually. And in my own family, nearly everyone has served in the military. So my dad, my brother, my sister, my uncles, my cousins, my grandfathers, my father-in-law all served in the military. And I always really respected their contribution to our society, to our country. And I saw some of the younger ones really grow from the experience. They really matured from the experience of being in the military. About 30 years ago, I worked at the VA in Reno, Nevada, and I really enjoyed working with the veteran population. I thought that they were really respectful of us as clinicians. They really needed good mental health treatment, and they really seemed to appreciate the work that we were doing. Their family members really appreciated the work that we were doing. So I really enjoyed working with veterans. And then early in my career, I specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. And a lot of my own studies have focused on how to help veterans with PTSD. So as you said, I ran the PTSD clinic here in San Diego for about 7 years at the VA. And I really learned so much from the veterans themselves, because one of the treatments that we do, we have the veterans go into detail about an experience that they had. And so through those stories, I learned a lot about kind of day-to-day life in the military and what that was like. So it helped me to be a better therapist for other veterans. And now I teach doctoral students who are really interested in working with military members. A lot of them are veterans themselves. And so through that work, we try to give back to the veteran community.
Do you have any tips for communicating with them or understanding them better?
Yeah. There are a lot of misunderstandings about uh, the military among civilians. A lot of people, when they hear military, they equate that with combat or they equate that with PTSD. A lot of folks refer to veterans as soldiers, but they're not all soldiers. Of course, that just applies to the Army. In fact, only a little over half of veterans ever deploy outside the United States. Fewer than 10% of deployed service members experience combat. So most people in the military don't ever experience combat. So that's kind of a common misunderstanding. Related to that, most veterans will not develop PTSD. Most veterans come out of the military without any mental health problems, including PTSD. A lot of us don't know how to talk to veterans, and so you'll find people thanking veterans for their service, but without really understanding what they're thanking them for. And a lot of veterans that we've spoken to prefer that people actually ask them questions about their military experience, so they want to be asked, or they ask that they donate to veteran organizations to support veterans that way. And one of the students that I'm working with now is currently conducting a dissertation where we're asking veterans what they think of that phrase, "thank you for your service." And we're getting a whole range of responses. Some veterans really like it, and some really don't like it. So we'll have more to report about that soon.
I know at least a couple of veterans who, at least I don't think they would really want to talk about their military experiences. So, how can we tell if sort of shutting down like this is a good thing for someone? And is it ever appropriate to sort of push them to open up?
That is an excellent question. Yeah, so it's not uncommon for veterans to avoid talking about their military experiences or thinking about their military experiences, especially if they have PTSD or related problems. And in fact, avoidance of any reminders of that potentially traumatic event is required for the diagnosis of PTSD. It's one of the symptoms. So these reminders of things, which we sometimes call triggers, can include talking to other people about it or seeing movies or TV shows related to the military or related to war, hearing certain sounds related to their traumatic experience, being in crowded situations, things like that. It's really common for veterans to feel guilty about things they did or didn't do during a traumatic event, even if they're telling the story to somebody and the outside observer would not assign any blame to the veteran. It's still very, very common that veterans feel ashamed and feel blamed for that. For example, if a veteran experiences military sexual trauma, they will feel guilt and shame, even though it's very obvious that somebody else attacked them. That's just a very almost universal experience related to PTSD. So the question of is it a good idea for them to shut down or not kind of depends. In the short term, of course, it's easier for veterans with PTSD to not talk about these things. But in the long term, one of the things that we've learned is that the people who avoid the most are the people who are most likely to get PTSD, ironically. So it depends on the context. So, if they're talking to a therapist, it's certainly a good idea to consider talking about it, and not just generically and not just a little bit, but to do that in detail repeatedly is one of the treatments that we have called prolonged exposure therapy. And so the veteran talks about the traumatic event, which of course is really difficult the first time they talk about it. But each time they talk about it, it gets easier to do. So one of the analogies I use with my students is to imagine the scariest movie that you've ever watched, and then to imagine watching that movie 50 times in a row. And eventually it would not be scary anymore. Eventually you'd even get bored with the story. It would still be unpleasant to watch, but it would get easier and easier each time you watched it. And it's the same with these veterans, even though these are memories of events that they experienced, it gets easier for them to deal with that without that intense response that PTSD entails.
I've been watching It's called For All Mankind on Apple about their astronauts, and one of them after a mission goes to see a therapist, and when a couple of people find out, they both of them are like, "You've got to stop that immediately because someone might find out, and they would scrub you from any future involvement in these programs." And I went, "Ooh." I hadn't really thought about that. And so it made me wonder, and even to this day, could that be a problem that people in the military face? So could you share any stigma that maybe prevents people from seeking mental health support while they're still serving?
Yes, that's such a good point. I'm really glad you brought that up. It's really common still today. And there are actually a number of different barriers to care to getting good mental health care for veterans and for active duty service members too. And some of those are like transportation and getting childcare, things like that. But stigma is a big one. And we've conducted several studies looking at stigma specifically in the military. And some military personnel worry that if they seek services, they will be considered weak, or that their peers or that the military leaders will treat them differently, or they worry that they'll lose out on promotions or that they won't get jobs that require security clearance. And a lot of those fears continue even when they're out of the military. Sometimes they literally can't talk about things because they were missions that they're not allowed to talk about. But even then, we can help veterans deal with their memories. But more often, it's the veteran themselves worries that if they disclose this, that they're going to lose their status in some way, or they're going to be viewed as weak. And so we really work hard to help them reduce that stigma. The good news is there's lots of different ways to reduce stigma. If you provide information to veterans about how common these problems are, that really is helpful. Just kind of normalizing it is a big help. So part of the psychoeducation that we do in treatment is just telling them how common these things are, the prevalence rates, things like that. And even more powerful is when they can hear their peers, other people that have been in the military, talk about their shared experiences, their shared symptoms, so they realize they're not alone. One of the things that's really cruel about PTSD and about depression and anxiety, all of those, a feature of that is isolation, that people tend to stay away from other people. And they lose social support, but they also lose sight of the fact that it's not just them having this experience. Other people are going through the same thing, but they're all in their own isolated experience. And so they don't know that other people are going through this. So it's an awful aspect of these disorders. And being able to talk to other people, like in group therapy or other settings, can really be helpful.
We talk about these things, but how widespread is the problem of veterans needing mental health support? And like, is there a percentage, do you know, of how many actually get the support that they need?
There have been several studies looking at this, and as I said, the one of the most important kind of take-home messages is that most people in the military do not develop mental health disorders. Some had mental health symptoms even going into the military, but most folks coming out of the military don't have they don't meet criteria for mental health disorders. However, some veterans are more likely to get mental health disorders than others. And of course, those who face combat are at especially high risk for a variety of different reasons. Even those who are deployed and don't face combat are at higher risk. There was a big study about 20 years ago now that focused on the veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. And it found that about 15% of them had significant anxiety or depression or PTSD or all three of them. And the rates went up a lot after experiencing combat. So they measured them before they left for combat and then after they got back. And of course, their rates went up as we would expect. However, less than half of those who had a mental disorder actually sought treatment in the military, and even fewer of those actually completed treatments. So there's a big step down from the people who need the treatment to the people who actually get the treatment.
In what ways is working with a veteran in a counseling setting different from working with a non-veteran?
Being in the military is similar to other jobs in lots of ways, but it's quite different in others, as you can imagine. And recognizing some of those differences can help the therapist communicate with the veteran, especially if the therapist is not a veteran themselves. So I encourage my students to really broaden their horizons for all cultures, including military culture. And actually, I teach a class called Diversity and Trauma. And so I talk about PTSD and how it relates to race and ethnicity, how it relates to gender, how it relates to age. And then we have a whole section on military culture because it really is a culture unto itself. And so I want my students to go out and experience more of the world outside of San Diego and outside of graduate school. And you can do that through reading books and through watching movies and TV shows. The information isn't always accurate, but most of it is. And so it's a good way to learn something more about the military. So I want them to learn kind of basics about rank structure. So every branch of the military has a different rank structure. There are different vehicles and weapons that veterans will refer to in treatment. And then there's just general terminology. So FOBs for forward operating base, for example, or meals ready to eat, MREs, things like that are good for therapists to know about, just so that they don't have to constantly interrupt the client. The other thing I want my students to understand and for therapists to appreciate more generally is that there are so many good things about being in the military. So in the media, we tend to hear about negative things during war. And from the veterans that we treat in VA hospitals and elsewhere, we hear negative stories usually, where we're asking them to report on their symptoms and things related to their symptoms. But there are lots of good things about the military too. Some veterans have a hard time coming back from the military into a civilian setting for lots of different reasons. Sometimes they feel like civilians don't take things seriously enough, and they feel like civilians don't follow through. And there's some truth to that. So I always advise my therapists to ensure that they're punctual, that they show up on time, that they're consistent with the veteran they're treating, that they have a structured approach to treatment, like we do in a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapies that we do. Because due in part to their military training, veterans tend to show up early and not just on time. They tend to complete the tasks that they're assigned, like the homework that we assign in treatment. And so just to be aware of those things makes us all better therapists.
If someone listening knows a veteran who's maybe a family member who they think should probably consider seeking professional help, what might that person say to persuade the veteran to do so? Do you have any tips or language that might be useful?
Yeah, that's another great question. So a lot of the veterans that I've worked with have had misunderstandings about what modern psychotherapy looks like. Many of them only come into therapy when they're pushed to do so by their loved ones. Like I can't tell you how many veterans I've treated that never would have come in for treatment if their girlfriend or wife, for example, hadn't pushed them into treatment. Some of those veterans have told me that they worry that they're going to be asked to lay back on a couch and talk about their mother, or that they're going to have to reveal their dark secrets to a room full of strangers in a group setting. But in fact, there are many different types of effective treatments. Therapists will never force the client to do anything. And so it's useful for potential clients to know that. A lot of the modern therapies that we use for PTSD and depression and other things really just encourage the veteran to notice their thoughts and notice their behaviors and notice how those aren't working towards getting them towards their long-term goals. So we ultimately help them change those thoughts and behaviors through new skills. So we teach them to apply new skills so that they can manage their emotions and kind of do the things that they want to be able to do. A lot of the treatments that we provide are really short, so they're about 4 months or less. We know that therapy works well in person, but we have also learned, including through my studies, that veterans can get equally improved through video conferencing therapy. So it's kind of a newer thing. It was highly prevalent during COVID, of course, and we know that it works just as well as being in person. So that makes it much more convenient for veterans that are considering treatment. The other important thing for veterans to know is once we have successfully treated their anxiety or depression or PTSD, those symptoms tend to stay resolved. We have data that going on for years and years after people have gone through these treatments, and they stay better, which is really important for veterans to know too, that they don't just have to keep coming back in for the rest of their life. Most of the veterans that I've worked with have told me that they wish they came in for treatment earlier. So conveying some of that information, and fundamentally, the most important thing is just conveying your love for the person, and that you care about them and that you worry about them and you want them to get the help. That goes a long way to getting them into treatment that they need.
Could you talk us through some of the characteristics or behaviors that a veteran might display when struggling with their mental health, such as having PTSD?
Some of the most common mental health symptoms that we see are veterans who isolate more, so they stick to themselves. So, and what's kind of interesting is a lot of them will describe themselves as a lone wolf and that they're not a people person, something like that. When in fact, when you do a full history, you find out that prior to the traumatic event, they were very social, very gregarious people. But the traumatic event fundamentally changed them, which happens with PTSD. So the isolation is something that happens after the fact, but a lot of times they don't make that connection. A lot of veterans with PTSD and related disorders lose interest in activities that they used to enjoy. They spend less time talking to other people. Irritability and anger are common symptoms. Eating and sleeping either more or less than they used to is common. And then with anxiety disorders and PTSD, veterans will avoid certain situations or places. That's really common. And as I said earlier, ironically, even though it makes sense that they're going to avoid those things, the people who avoid the most are the people who are most likely to develop PTSD. So many of the best treatments that we have for PTSD help veterans to face their fears and to get their lives back.
Another TV reference, I guess. I was watching This Is Us, and I don't actually recommend this show because it was a little too depressing, I thought. But anyhow, in the later seasons, it introduced a woman veteran character who was facing some psychological trauma, which I thought was interesting. I don't think I've ever seen that anywhere in the media really depicted. And so I wondered, what about women veterans? Do they handle psychological trauma any differently from men?
They do. That's a great question too, and I remember all those episodes. I watched all of that series as well, and I have to be careful about who I recommend it to because it's an excellent series. But of course, there's the traumatic event of the fire, and there's the traumatic event for two different characters of combat. Well, three different characters with combat. So it's an excellent series and kind of demonstrates some of the things that we're talking about. So we know that men are actually most likely to be exposed to what we call potentially traumatic events. So those could include things like combat or being assaulted or car accident, vehicle accidents, things like that. However, women who are exposed to events like that, potentially traumatic events, are more likely to develop PTSD. So the rate of PTSD is quite a bit higher in women than in men as a result of that. There's lots of different theories about why that would be the case. One of the strongest theories is that it's the type of traumatic event that matters, and women are more likely to survive interpersonal traumas, which are sometimes called betrayal traumas. And we know that those types of events are more likely to lead to PTSD. So the good news is, even though there's that difference in PTSD rates, both women and men respond equally well to the best psychotherapies that we have for PTSD.
And what about older adult veterans? Are there any differences in treating them compared to the younger?
Yes, I love that question. I love working with older veterans, especially. That's been the focus of a lot of my clinical trials, is focusing on the older veteran population. One of the things that was fascinating to me when I first reviewed this literature, the treatment literature for older adults, is first of all how small it was. There were only five empirical studies when I first started looking into this, and the biggest of them only had three people in it. The other four studies were only single case studies. So that kind of gives you an idea of how understudied this is. The other thing that stood out to me is that even though there was almost no data out there, a lot of authors were writing in to say, oh, you should be really careful about applying the treatment that's the best studied treatment for PTSD, which is called exposure therapy. You got to be really careful in working with older adults. And it was implying that they were too fragile, that cognitively, physically, they wouldn't be able to handle it, which I always felt was kind of ageist, frankly. And so I set out to test it out to see if that was accurate or not. And so we've had a few studies where we've investigated this. And we've compared exposure therapy. There's one type of exposure therapy called prolonged exposure therapy. And so I just tested it in its standard form to see if it would work with older veterans. And it turned out that they benefited just as much as younger veterans do. So that was great to hear. So we don't have to modify the treatment. We don't have to invent a new treatment. We have several existing treatments that are going to work well for older adults. That being said, older adults often are less familiar with psychotherapy. They're often less familiar with the PTSD diagnosis. So I had one guy come in and he's like, "Oh, my primary care doctor is saying I have this PTDS thing." And so that might require more time in psychoeducation to teach them about these things before you get started with the treatments.
And what about veteran people of color?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I really wish we knew more, but in the empirical literature, there are many studies now looking at veterans, including combat veterans and people who have been deployed. Uh, those samples tend to be predominantly white samples. Sometimes there are small proportions of people of color, but often statistically, there's not enough power to do separate analyses of those folks, or even kind of subsamples within those. So, all Asian Americans are lumped together in a study, for example, rather than parsing it out into folks from different countries. So we need more research that includes larger samples or that specializes specifically in a sample of veterans of color. That would be very useful. What we do know is that there are some indications that there are differential rates of PTSD for people of color. There's some evidence that that's because people of color are more often put into the front lines in combat, for example, so that their exposure to traumatic events is higher. The good news is that for the treatments that we have, most of the studies that are out there show that there is benefit to veterans of color from those treatments. So that's promising, but again, we need more research in this area.
You've already touched on this, but as you said, there are positive traits that people develop in the military too. Would you care to share anything else about those?
I would, yes. There are many beneficial things about the military. It provides active duty folks with a way to serve their country. It gives them a sense of purpose and mission. We know how important that is psychologically to have a sense of meaning and purpose and mission in life. It enhances camaraderie, which is a big benefit of the military. So people really learn to rely on each other. There's interdependence. Really, people have love for one another within their unit. And that's something that leads to lifelong friendships. Um, People learn job skills in the military, of course, and it provides steady employment to people who might not have other opportunities in their region. A lot of my veterans told me that they really benefited from the structure and the physical activity that are inherent in the military. And of course, for people who are deployed, again, slightly over half of veterans, they get to learn about new cultures and see the world and sometimes learn new languages. And so that's another benefit.
So I wanted to end on a positive note like that. So for the final question, could you share a story of a veteran who struggled with their mental health, but then learned to manage it and went on to accomplish great things?
Yes, I have many such stories, but I'll share one with you. I was working with an older veteran who had experienced an awful traumatic event early in his military career. He was still a teenager, in fact. In the several decades before he came in for treatment, he had been miserable because of this traumatic event. He'd been unable to function in his jobs. He'd had multiple jobs. He'd had multiple marriages, and his friendships didn't really last because of his PTSD following that awful traumatic event. So as we worked together, he was able to learn to tolerate these unpleasant memories of the event. He started doing the things that he used to enjoy and getting pleasure from that again. By the end of treatment, he was able to start new hobbies. He was exploring new places and kind of going on his own adventures. He was spending time with his grandchildren for the first time. He'd been estranged from his children. And so that was a really big goal of his and something we were able to accomplish. So, one of the fascinating things to me, too, about doing treatment with these veterans is that as a therapist, we will often notice the beneficial changes even before the veteran does. We'll notice little things that show that they're getting better. and their loved ones do too. And so very often we'll hear from their partner or someone else about their progress, and they'll notice it before the veteran does too. So in this case, his wife told me that she had her husband back, and it was that profound, that powerful, that she really felt like she recognized the old him that kind of prior to PTSD. So it's really amazing and satisfying for me to know that even after decades of having PTSD, people can recover really just within a matter of several months.
You've just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere. This episode was made possible through a PsychI sponsorship with the Alliant International University, California School of Professional Psychology, that's CSPP. Founded in 1969, CSPP was one of the nation's first independent schools of professional psychology. Today, CSPP continues its commitment to preparing the next generation of mental health professionals and advocates. Their dedication to ensuring every community's access to quality mental health care extends from integrated care to inclusive family therapy. Explore their programs at https://info.alliant.edu/partner-psychi, which is spelled PSICHI. I'll put a link in the show notes for this episode. Did you know that springtime is the busiest time for welcoming new members to PsychI? Local chapters at over 1,000 colleges and universities induct new members each spring. Could one of these new members be you? If you've been listening to the show and you aren't already a member, you might be surprised to learn that you could be eligible. PsychI membership is open to undergraduate psychology majors who meet the academic requirements described online. Everyone knows that, right? But did you know that membership is also open to psychology minors, as well as majors or minors in programs related to psychology? Graduate students in psychology or a related program can join too. And so can faculty members teaching full or part-time. Even some alumni members are eligible if you graduated before your local PsychI chapter was established. If you'd like to join our PsychI community and receive PsychI membership benefits, go check out the membership requirements at www.psychi, that's PSICHI.org/become_member. If you haven't already subscribed to Psych Everywhere, go ahead and follow us wherever you go for podcasts. Tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Word of mouth is a huge help for podcasts, so share what you learned at the dinner table or in your classes. You can also follow us on Twitter at PsychI Podcast and leave a review at Apple Podcast or wherever you go for podcasts. Pretty recently, someone told me that they really enjoyed the episode about resilience with Dr. Susan Becker, and it absolutely did make my day. I love hearing that. So believe me when I say you will absolutely make my day. And more importantly, of course, you'll be helping us to get Psych everywhere. Okay, that's all for now. I'll connect with you again soon. Copyright 2024, PsychI, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.